Greetings everyone, welcome to the 13th episode of Churches of Wales Season 1. In this series, I take a look at buildings part of the Church in Wales and Covenanted churches in Wales. In the last episode, I looked at churches between the towns of Builthwells and Brecon, where I saw many beautiful buildings in settlements like Merthyr-Cynog, Devinoch, Betws Penpont, and more. In this episode, I will look at churches around the towns of Brecon, Talgarth, and Hay-on-Wye. I am Fabian Mustoe, and I present you the first season of Churches of Wales. In order to find these churches, I will use the Ordnance Survey map on Geograph as my reference for spotting church symbols, from maps of the 1920s, to maps of the 2010s and 20s. I apologize if some of my pronunciations of these place names are incorrect, since I am not a Welsh speaker. The first settlement I am at is on the west bank of the River Usk, and this has a church dedicated to St. David. This was built from 1859 to 61 to the design of John Clayton of Hereford, and this was enlarged in 1878, and from 1923 to 25. The Victorian church was built on the site of a medieval church, mentioned by this Cambro-Norman priest and historian in 1188. The interior has stained glass by Clayton and Bell from 1860, and by James Powell from 1924, when the lean-to aisles and clerestory were added to the church plan. The interior houses a recut medieval font with an octagonal bowl, and the church building was Grade II listed in May 1961. On the east bank of the River Usk is the market town of Brecon, historically the county town of Breconshire. Brecon is the third largest town in Powys with a population of 8,254 at the 2021 census, and there are some religious buildings west of Usk Bridge. This Welsh Wesleyan Methodist chapel, on Newmarch Street, was built in 1871 in the sub-classical style, and this was converted to residential use by 1992. This replaced an earlier chapel in Chapel Street, which is on the east side of the Usk. This was built in 1824 and closed in 1871, and the building appearance has been modified since. In the grounds of Christ College is the chapel of St. Nicholas Dominican Friary, which was built with the friary around the mid-13th century. The friary was demolished in 1539 during the dissolution of the monasteries, except the chapel survived since it is part of Christ College, founded by royal charter in 1541 by Henry VIII of England. The college and chapel are depicted on the County of Brecknock map by John Speed from 1607, and after the English Civil War from 1642 to 51, the chapel building was in ruinous condition. This engraving of the chapel dates from 1813, and later that century, the building was restored by J.P. Seddon from 1859 to 72. This restoration involved the demolition and rebuilding of the north wall, and the college was rebuilt at the same time when it became a public school in 1855 by Act of Parliament. The chapel houses several monuments from the late 17th to early 18th century, and this monument to Richard Lucy dates from the 1690s, sometime after he passed away in 1690. The interior mainly has medieval origins, despite the north wall was rebuilt in the Victorian times, and the panelled wagon roof in the chancel dates from the Victorian restoration from 1859 to 72. The stained glass in the east window dates from 1863, designed by J.P. Seddon and installed by Clayton and Bell. The chapel and remains of the nave of former friary to the west, the latter of which can be seen in the foreground, were Grade I listed in December 1976. The east bank of the River Usk in Brecon is where most of the religious buildings are situated at, and one of the new churches in Brecon is the Elim Pentecostal Church on Canal Road, built in 2011 and opened later that year on Wednesday 23 November. The church is situated west from the Brecon Canal Basin on the Monmouthshire and Brecon Canal, and north from that canal basin is the Calvinistic Methodist Chapel on the B4601 road. This was built to the design of W. F. Poulton from Reading in 1866, and the Gothic-style building has an octagonal spire on the bell tower, which was repaired in 1955 after it was struck by thunder in August that year. The building was Grade 2 listed in December 1976, along with the forecourt wall, piers, railings and gates. Situated in Lion Street is the Plough United Reformed Church, formerly the Welsh Congregational Independent Chapel. The building of 1841 is in the classical style, built on the site of an earlier chapel from 1699, which is one of the earliest independent chapel congregations in mid-Wales. The chapel took its name from the house where early meetings took place, and the present building was mainly rebuilt in 1892 by local builder Benjamin Jenkins. The interior is noted for its rich woodwork and elaborate panelled ceiling, and this was Grade 2 star listed in December 1976. The bell tower behind me can be seen from miles and around the town of Brecon, and this is the parish church of St. Mary. This church is situated in the town centre, and this became the parish church of Brecon in 1923, when the then parish church of St. John the Evangelist became Brecon Cathedral. The West Tower, known as Buckingham Tower, was built in 1521 for military purposes, funded by Edward Stafford, the 3rd Duke of Buckingham. The church was originally a chapel of ease to St. John's Benedictine Priory, and there is a scalloped capital in the nave, which suggests 12th century origins. The church was repaired in 1805 and 1831, and Thomas Henry Wyatt restored the building from 1856 to 57. The stained glass in the east window in the chancel, the Risen Christ, was designed by John Petts in 1989, replacing stained glass by Charles Gibbs from 1856. The church still has some Victorian stained glass, although the stained glass in this window dates from 1929, installed in the east end of the south aisle by A.K. Nicholson Stained Glass Studios. The church houses the Tower Cafe, in the south aisle, open from 9 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. from Monday to Saturday, and the church is open until 4 p.m. on these days. The building was Grade 2 star listed in January 1952. There is a memorial stone to Thomas Coke at St. Mary Parish Church, who was born in Brecon on 9 September 1747. Coke established the Methodist missions overseas by the turn of the 18th century, and he was one of the first 2 bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church, founded by John Wesley in December 1784 at Baltimore, Maryland in the United States of America. There was a Wesleyan Methodist chapel dedicated to Thomas Coke in Lion Street, built in 1835 as a replacement to an earlier chapel from 1770, situated in Little Free Street. The second chapel building was demolished in 1978 after a fire, and Bishop Bevan Hall and Co-op food supermarket stands on the chapel site. Situated in Glamorgan Street is the English Congregational Independent Chapel, built in 1835 of the sub-classical style. This was built by David Blow, the first English Congregational minister who donated part of his garden for the chapel site. The building housed the Brecknock Museum from 1927 to 1974, and it houses an independently run community arts and cultural venue as of January 2023, known as the Muse. The building was Grade 2 listed in January 1952, and west from there is the Roman Catholic Church of St. Michael, built by Charles Francis Hansom in 1851, who was one of the leading architects of Roman Catholic churches in the mid-19th century. The exterior has changed little since, but the interior was redecorated in 2010. The church was Grade 2 listed in December 1976. This branch of Boots, a health and beauty retailer and pharmacy chain, is situated in Bethel Square, and the store moved into this building during the 1990s. The building was converted to commercial use at this time, since some years earlier, the building was in a dilapidated state, as seen in this photograph from 1987. This was the Bethel Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, built in the sub-classical style by Watkins of Llanfaes in 1852. The building was Grade 2 listed in May 1961, and the chapel closed as a place of worship in 1980. Placed by the River Hunthey is Watergate Baptist Church, built in 1806 and rebuilt by the Reverend William Lewis of Aberdare in 1833. This was rebuilt again in 1880, with the addition of a vestry and schoolroom. This was Grade 2 listed in December 1976. The Kensington Baptist Church and adjoining hall were built in 2012, and they replaced two buildings on the site. They were built in the Gothic style in 1877, replacing an earlier chapel from 1824. These buildings were demolished in 2011, after subsidence caused structural defects. Here is the Cathedral Church of St. John the Evangelist in Brecon, which is the cathedral of the Diocese of Swansea and Brecon in the Church in Wales. This is also the seat of the Bishop of Swansea and Brecon, and the cathedral has origins to 1093 when it was the Benedictine Priory of St. John the Evangelist, built by the Normans on the site of an earlier Celtic church. There was a 3 or 4 story screen at the east end, known as the Golden Rood. This was dismantled in 1538, the year the priory was dissolved during the dissolution of the monasteries. The priory church was converted to the parish church by 1539, and the surviving chapter house and deanery from the priory was built in the mid to late 13th century. They were Grade 1 listed in January 1952. The church was restored several times in the late 18th and early 19th century, and Sir George Gilbert Scott restored the building from the 1870s, when he improved the nave, aisles, porch and fittings, and he completed the vaulting in the presbytery which kept the 15th century roof intact. In the mid-1910s, the central bell tower of the 16th century had structural problems, which was fixed from strengthening work by this architect, who went on to build the St. Lawrence Chapel and organ chamber from 1929 to 30, and the reredos in the chancel in 1937. The parish church became a cathedral in 1923, on the establishment of the Diocese of Swansea and Brecon. The building mainly dates from a rebuild of 1230, and only a few pieces of masonry survive from the 11th century church. The Romanesque font in the west end of the nave is an example, and this is reminiscent of the Herefordshire school of Romanesque sculpture. There are several recumbent effigies in the cathedral, and one of these is the Games monument from around 1555. There were other monuments of this style in the chancel, which were reputedly burned by Cromwell's soldiers in the English Civil War. North from the chancel is the Havard Chapel from the 14th century, which was adapted in 1922 as a memorial to the South Wales borderers, known as the 24th Regiment of Foot and 2nd Warwickshire Regiment. There is a tomb effigy to Walter and Christina Aubrey in the chapel, and this dates from the 14th century. This is one of the oldest features in the cathedral, along with the 15th century pulpit in the nave, which reuses parts of the long-gone Golden Rood screen. The cathedral was Grade 1 listed in January 1952. On the outskirts of Brecon to the east are the earthworks of a chapel, dedicated to this local saint from the 5th or 6th century AD. The historian of Breconshire at the turn of the 18th century, Theophilus Jones, described the site as completely ruined, and the site was excavated a few times in the late 1990s. Here is the parish church of St. David in this settlement, situated 1.5 miles north from Brecon. The cruciform plan building is in a circular churchyard, which suggests a class foundation from the 6th century AD. The present building mainly dates from the 13th century, and the bell tower dates from the 1620s. The south porch of 1900 was built by Ewan Christian, and it houses several carved stones from the 11th to 12th century. The font in the west end of the nave is medieval, and the church was restored in 1883 and 1900. This was Grade 1 listed in January 1963. There was a Calvinistic Methodist chapel in the village, situated east from St. David Parish Church. Built in 1865 of the simple round-headed style, the Ebenezer Chapel was altered into a house after the chapel closed as a place of worship. 2 miles northeast from that settlement is the Church of St. Mary, built in the 15th century with earlier origins. The church had a west bell tower that was demolished in the early 19th century, and this was replaced by a timber belfry. The building was restored in 1862 by Thomas Nicholson of Hereford, who also designed the timber belfry and restored the chancel arch. He retained the late 13th century font and medieval panelled ceiling, with multiple roll moulds to ribs that dates from the 15th century. The church was Grade II listed in March 2005. The Tabernacle Baptist Chapel northeast from the previous settlement has origins to 1746, and this was replaced by a chapel building from 1805, then replaced by the present building from 1835. This Georgian building is in the simple round-headed style, and this was altered in the early 20th century. The chapel was Grade II listed in February 1998. This rural English Baptist church, situated in woodland, was built of stone in 1855. This was still in use, a place of worship as recent as the 2010s. 2 miles west from Crickadarn is the Sion United Reformed Church, which was a place of worship as recent as the 2000s. This was built as the Congregational Independent Chapel in 1888. The Church of St. Dubricius is west from the chapel, built around the 14th century with medieval origins. The church was mainly destroyed by a fire in 1876, which led to a rebuild in 1878 with the original windows reused in the new structure. The fixtures from this restoration include the pulpit and lectern, and there is a stained glass window to the patron saint in the north wall, installed by Celtic Studios in 1993. The building was Grade II listed in August 2001. A mile and a half west from that settlement is a rural Congregational Independent Chapel, first built around 1740 and rebuilt in the early or mid-19th century. The exterior retains its Georgian character, and the interior houses monuments from the 19th century. This was Grade II listed in February 1998. On the west bank of the River Wye is the Church of St. Mauritius, probably built in the 18th century on the site of an earlier church with medieval origins. The nave of this church is 10.68 metres in length, which makes this one of the smallest churches in Wales. The chancel was repaired in the 19th century, and the church was Grade II listed in March 1962. There is a Maes-y tree in the churchyard, which had a girth of 28 feet 6 inches in 2002. That church is by the A470 road, along with this English Baptist church, built in 1827, and altered in the mid-19th century. The exterior and interior has changed little since, and this was Grade II listed in August 2001. The Church of St. Mary in Crickadarn has origins to the 15th century, and the West Bell Tower dates from the 15th or early 16th century. The font in the west end of the nave is from the 14th or 15th century, while the nave and chancel dates from the 16th century. The church was in a dilapidated state in the early 19th century, and was restored in 1867, 1895 and 1906. The village featured in An American Werewolf in London from 1981, and the bell tower was repaired in 1982 and the church in 1993. This was Grade II star listed in March 1962. The Congregational Independent Chapel was built in 1854, and is situated east from St. Mary Church. This replaced an earlier chapel from 1816, and the present building was altered in 1901. This was Grade II listed in August 2001. South of the River Wye is the Church of St. Gwenddwr, situated east from the A470 and A479 road junction. The oval churchyard suggests a class foundation from the 6th century AD, and the present building originates to the 15th century or earlier. The church was restored by Charles Buckeridge from 1862 to 63, although the roof collapsed during the work, so it was substantially rebuilt. The stained glass in the east window was installed in the 1920s, as a war memorial to the people that gave their lives in the First World War. The church was Grade II listed in December 1995, along with the English Presbyterian Church by the A479 road, built around 1836 and renovated in 1879. This was the Calvinistic Methodist chapel until 1904, when it transferred to the Presbyterian Church. This closed for worship by the turn of the 21st century. West from the village is a Congregational Independent chapel, built in 1791, and rebuilt in the vernacular style in 1803. The building was in use as a place of worship for 2 centuries, which was converted to secular use by the 2000s. This does not have listed status as of January 2023. Northeast from St. Matthew's Church is a former Calvinistic Methodist chapel, built in 1853. The Bethel Chapel was a private residence by 2001. The Grade 2 listed stone and timber lychgate to St. Matthew's Church dates from the 18th century, and this is the main entrance to the church from the east. The church dates from the late 15th century with 12th century origins, and the panelled barrel roof from nave to chancel and rood screen dates from the 15th century. These features are intact since the church did not go through Victorian restoration, although the screen is missing its rood loft. The church was carefully restored by E.V. Collier of Carmarthen in 1905, and the building received Grade 1 listed status in January 1963. I am in the village and community of Bronllys, which has a parish church dedicated to St. Mary. This has origins to the 12th century, although the present building was built by Nicholson and Son from 1889 to 90. The church has a detached bell tower from the 14th century, which is a rarity in Wales. This was Grade 2 star listed in September 1961, and the church was Grade 2 listed at the same time. The Calvinistic Methodist chapel in Church Street was built in 1865, built in the vernacular style. The Bethel Chapel was succeeded by a new chapel from 1929, built in the sub-classical style. This closed for worship in the 2000s, and was subsequently converted to a private residence. West from the village is Bronllys Hospital, where there is a chapel in the arts and craft style from 1920. This was built to the designs of Edwin T. Hall and Stanley Hall of London, and this was Grade 2 listed in June 1988. I am in the market town and community of Talgarth, situated a mile southeast from Bronllys. The parish church in Talgarth is dedicated to St. Gwenddwr, established as a class settlement in the 6th century AD on the site of her resting place. Gwenddwr was a daughter of this king in this ancient independent kingdom, and Talgarth was the royal residence for the king during this time. Talgarth was also the capital of this kingdom. The present building dates from the 14th century, and the north transept in this Georgian engraving was replaced with an organ chamber and vestry in 1893. The west bell tower of 3 stages dates from the 15th century, and the church was restored by Thomas Nicholson in 1873. The 4-bay arcade in the nave and south aisle dates from the late 14th century, and the south aisle was built during this time. The Francis Chapel is in the east end of the aisle. The church was Grade 2 star listed in September 1961, and west from there is the English Presbyterian Chapel, built by George Morgan of Carmarthen in 1870. This replaced an earlier chapel from 1821 or 1828, and the chapel closed as a place of worship in August 2021. This was converted to a private house in 2022. The Wesleyan Methodist Chapel in Bell Street was built in 1848, and this closed for worship during the 20th century. South from there is the English Baptist Church on Regent Street, built in 1836 in the simple round-headed style. The building housed 109 seats in 1851, which increased to 350 in 1906, and the Tabernacle Chapel housed a live music venue after the chapel closed for worship in 2014. It now houses a holiday home as of February 2022. West from there is the Bethania United Reformed Church, built in 1811 and rebuilt in 1822. This chapel was replaced with the present building of 1891, and the Gothic-style chapel closed for worship in the early 2010s. Half a mile southeast from the town is the former Mid Wales Hospital, and a chapel is situated north from the hospital grounds. This was built with the hospital in 1900 by these architects, and fell into disuse when the hospital closed in 1999. 2.5 miles east from Talgarth is this tranquil church, situated west from the Black Mountains. The patron saint of this church lived in the 6th century AD, and this building has origins to the 13th and 15th century. The south porch was added in the 16th century, and the rood screen and loft dates from around the 14th century. This screen has seen little change over the centuries, and the medieval wall paintings are intact. The church was carefully restored by Baldwin of Brecon in 1905, and the building was Grade 1 listed in September 1961. The church has been managed by the Friends of Friendless Churches since 1999, the year the church closed as a place of worship. 2 miles north from that church is a Calvinistic Methodist chapel, built in the simple round-headed style in 1862. This was converted to a private residence by 2000. North from the A439 road are the foundations of a medieval chapel, which was a chapel of ease to Glasbury. The plan consists of a nave and chancel, and the building fell into a dilapidated state during the 18th century. Half a mile northeast is the parish church in Glasbury, situated east of the A438 road. This is dedicated to 2 saints, the first is Saint Peter, and the second is a 5th century saint who presumably established a church here, and is buried in the village. The original site of the church was located on the floodplain of the River Wye, and since the Wye undermined that site during the 17th century, the church moved to the present site in 1665, but this was replaced with a new building from 1837 to 38. This was built by Louis Vulliamy in the Norman Revival style, and the chancel was built in 1881. The organ chamber was added in 1910, and the church was Grade 2 listed in December 1995. The English Baptist Church on Treble Hill was first built around 1820, which was replaced by a building from 1866 in the sub-classical and Romanesque style. This was Grade 2 listed in March 1994, then closed as a place of worship by the 2000s. This has housed a bunkhouse for Wye Valley canoes since the mid-2010s. 2 miles south from Hay-on-Wye is this village and community, which has a parish church dedicated to this saint from the 1st century AD. There are rumours about the patron saint of this church, since the church may be dedicated to this person from the 5th century, who was the brother of the second patron saint of Glasbury Church. The south porch was built in the 14th century, and it houses a belfry with 3 bells that dates from 1687. The nave is the earliest part of the church, dating from the 13th century, and the chancel was built in the 14th century. The church was restored during the 19th century, and the building was Grade 2 listed in September 1961. Here is the parish church of St. Mary in the market town of Hay-on-Wye, well known for their second-hand bookshops and the Hay Festival. The church is situated by the B4350 road, and the building has origins to the 12th century. This was derelict by the 18th century, replaced by a new building by Edward Haycock Sr. from 1833 to 34. The chancel was enlarged by Thomas Nicholson of Hereford in 1866, and the chancel was repaired in 1880. The gallery in the west end of the nave dates from 1866, and the organ by Bevington and Sons of London, with 3 manuals and around 2,000 pipes, is from 1883. The church was Grade 2 listed in October 1951. Situated in Oxford Road is the Wesleyan Methodist Church, built in 1903, when the Italianate tower was added to an earlier chapel of 1822. The Trinity Chapel replaced an earlier chapel from 1872, while the chapel of 1822 replaced the first chapel of 1770. These photographs date from 1904, and the chapel of 1903 closed for worship by the 2000s. Situated by the B4350 road is St. Joseph's Catholic Church, built as a Calvinistic Methodist chapel in the simple Gothic style in 1872. This replaced an earlier chapel from 1828, and the tabernacle chapel closed for worship by the 1960s. Internal alterations were made by F.R. Bates, son and Price of Newport in 1968, the year the building was acquired for use as a Catholic church. On the corner of Y End Road and Broad Street is the Globe, an arts and performance venue that is housed in a former Congregational Independent chapel. The Ebenezer Chapel was built in the sub-classical style in 1845, and this housed the United Reformed Church by the time the building was Grade II listed in February 1988. This closed for worship by 2000. The Apostolic Church in Newport Street was built in the early 20th century, and this was a place of worship until the 2010s, when it was converted to a private house by 2021. The Guild Chapel of St. John the Baptist dates from 1254, which was used by the Guild of the Tradesmen, and served as a chapel for Hay Castle. It was dissolved by Edward VI of England in 1547, and the building subsequently had many uses, including a jail, police station and fire station. The building was restored in 1930, and was Grade II listed in October 1951. The English Baptist Church in Bell Bank was built in 1877, but its history traces back to the mid-1640s, when John Miles established a Baptist congregation in the town. This is one of the oldest nonconformist chapels in Wales, although the chapel closed for worship by 2020. The building has housed the Wye Valley Yoga Studios since 2022. The last building I will look at in this episode is the primitive Methodist Chapel in Oxford Road, built in the simple Gothic style in 1868. The Bethesda Church has housed the Evangelical Church since 1953, and the church had a mission hall in Lion Street that was built in 1928. This was converted to a private residence in the late 2010s. I am back at Talgarth to end this episode, with St. Gwendolyn Parish Church seen to my left. I enjoyed looking at religious buildings from Brecon to Hay-on-Wye, and I will continue looking at them in the next episode as I head south to Crickadarn.